Let's talk about ethics. Whenever we talk about ethics in mass communication, a lot of times people erroneously think that we're going to be talking about religion and morality, and that can be part of an ethical system, but it's not necessarily the approach we're going to take today. We're going to focus on ethics from a mass communication perspective. More particularly, we'll talk about different approaches to ethics, different ethical systems of ways of making decisions, as well as how that might play out in the workplace for you. So let's get started by talking about one of the main ethical principles covered in your book. That is the golden mean. I'm sure you may have heard of this before. This ethical principle refers to the belief that everything in moderation is good. It's fine as long as what you're doing is in moderation. I have one of my favorite quotes from Oscar Wilde there too. Everything in moderation, including moderation. So take that however you would like. How this might apply to television? Well, it could apply to the consumption of television or media. If you adhere to the golden mean, you might say, yes, I watch television, yes, I binge watch, but it's not all that I do, and I have a pretty rich and fulfilling life outside of a screen, so it's justified behavior. That's one example of how the golden mean might play out in a media-related context. The categorical imperative, I've got a picture of Spock here because if you had to describe ethical principles in Star Trek terms, Spock would be the categorical imperative. If you really adopt this as your belief system, then you really see the world in black and white. There's no gray area. Logic rules here, and what is right for one is going to be right for everyone. When you're trying to make an ethical decision, you turn to your conscience because that's what's going to tell you exactly what's right and exactly what's wrong. So maybe you are like this in your life, or you might know someone for whom there is very little gray area in the world. And that's the categorical imperative. When you're making a decision, you will make a decision based on what you perceive as the right thing to do for everyone involved. Now, how this might impact mediated content is kind of interesting to think about it. A little bit challenging and a little bit of a brain stretch. But if you think about mediated content with the categorical imperative, let's say you're a media content producer and you are making decisions about a new show that's going to go online. You're going to develop it for online-only audience, and you are trying to decide about a particular casting decision, and you have the option to go with one actor or actress over another. And one actor or actress might shift the balance of the audience, might attract a different audience, might attract a unique perspective. Then you make decisions based on what you think is going to be the right decision for everyone who watches the show, as opposed to who might be the right actor or actress for the part. That's an example of how categorical imperative might impact mediated content in some way. Now, the veil of ignorance. This one sounds bad, but it's not. This ethical principle refers to the belief that justice is served when everyone is treated the same way, regardless of background, regardless of where you might be coming from in life. So you structure your actions as a professional to protect those who are vulnerable in society. This to me is kind of like the social work theory, where you are trying very hard to make sure that your decisions are treating everyone exactly fairly. You can see how this contrasts with the categorical imperative, which is determined to do the right thing, because that implies there's a wrong thing. Here, the right or wrong thing, the wrong thing would be treating someone unfairly or hurting someone. So how this might apply to media, again, is kind of difficult to think about. But what you want to think about is everyone obtaining equal access to something like Wi-Fi? We still have a pretty big digital divide in our country, and the fact that not everyone has the same access to wireless internet could be seen as an injustice to a lot of people. And so that might prompt somebody to make a decision to broaden broadband access or Wi-Fi access to an entire city, to an entire region or area, just to balance the playing field a little bit. That's veil of ignorance. Now, the last one is self-determination. This one is one that I'm sure most of you have heard of, maybe even adopted for yourself. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. What this basically means is that human beings should never be treated or used as a means to an end. So what that means is you treat others the way that you want to be treated. I think a lot of us in our everyday life probably try very hard to adhere to this ethical principle. Now, when you think about this applying to media, how in the world does that apply? Can you think about any television shows that might directly violate this principle? The example I always like to give is with The Bachelor. I don't know if any of you are fans of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, really popular ABC TV show. I used to be a very big fan of it back several years ago. I was a religious watcher of The Bachelor, and the season that really did me in was the time that Melissa was the one of the candidates, and her bachelor proposed to her. Spoiler alert: he proposed to her, and then at the recap show, where they bring back everybody after the show's finished filming and finished airing, he broke up with Melissa and decided to propose to the other girl instead. Yikes! This was TV gold, and people were very upset about it. We were all up in arms. I remember throwing pillows. I was so mad, and I decided I was done with The Bachelor. But that's an example of how in something like a reality television show, a lot of times the people who are part of those reality shows aren't treated unfairly, but they also are used really as a means to an end. That end is to sell television and to sell advertising for television shows. So here's an example of people being used and heartbroken, and real feelings get involved, and poor Melissa went on to a great career, and she's much happier now and better off, but at the time it seemed heartbreaking, and it was definitely using someone as a means to an end. Now, I've covered all the basic ethical systems that your book talks about. Let's talk a little bit about the personal versus professional ethics. The two systems can clash, and the longer you work as a professional in any field, the more chances you'll have to put your personal ethics into play or determine if the professional ethics are really what's going to judge or guide your judgment. Especially those of you who go into the media field, there are opportunities every day for you to make ethical decisions, and sometimes what you personally believe conflicts with what you are supposed to do as a professional. I'll give you an example. There's the wonderful example, sad example, of the Pulitzer Prize winning photographer who went to Africa to take pictures, and one of the pictures he took was of a small, maybe 3-year-old little boy who was just skin and bones. He was malnourished, and he was near death. He was so malnourished. And the photographer took a picture of the boy with a crow standing beside it, and it was implying that the crow was about to eat the little boy. Really hard example, and you probably are familiar with this picture that I'm talking about. An ethical decision has to come into play. As a photographer, it's your professional job to document what's going on in the world. In this case, it was the photographer's job to document the travesty of poverty and hunger across the world. Personally, your ethical system, no doubt, is screaming at you in that instance. Help this child, do something about it if there's anything at all that you could do. But if you do that, then you might impose on the professional ethics system that you have. A little side note about that example, that particular photographer struggled with that decision that he made the rest of his life. It was actually hard for him to function normally after he ended up taking that picture. And the picture was prolific and won all of these awards and brought a lot of attention to a really important area, but at what cost? Here's an example of professional versus personal ethics really clashing. Now, I hope none of you are ever in a position to make an ethical decision that's that serious and that's that life or death. But if you are, it's important to remember that every professional organization does have standards, or most of the ones in communication do at least. I'll give you an example of some of those. The Society of Professional Journalists, we have a chapter here on campus, definitely worth getting involved in. The National Association of Broadcasters, Radio and TV News Directors Association, Motion Picture Association of America, Public Relations Society of America. All of these professional organizations, which you very well might be part of someday, or maybe you're part of now as a student, part of their responsibility and part of their job is to make sure that professionals adhere to the same level of ethical standards. For example, the Public Relations Society of America, one of their ethical standards is, you don't lie to people. Definitely don't want to lie. You want to never mislead a public. That's part of the job of a public relations professional, is not to lie, is to instead work with publics and communicate professionally and on important topics. So that's an example of where personal versus professional ethics might come into play. Now, we also have different things to consider about professional guidelines. They are voluntary. At the end of the day, nobody's really holding your feet to the fire to follow these ethical guidelines unless you are working for a particular organization that would fire you for doing something that violates one of those guidelines. There are standards in place that are there to protect professionals and to help make decision making a little bit easier whenever you are faced with a tough decision. If it's a tough ethical decision, what you can say is, I have personal feelings about this, but let me consult my professional ethical code and see if the Society of Professional Journalists has anything to say about what I should do in this instance. And those codes can actually be very helpful and help a lot of professionals make important decisions. So if you violate an ethical standard from one of those organizations, nothing's really going to happen necessarily, like I said, unless you're at an organization that would penalize you for violating one. Now, we also have other types of ethical guidelines at the policy level, at the organizational policy level, editorial policy levels. We have varying levels of policy that guide decision-making and behavior depending on the different type of media industry that you might go into. Always important to think about those guidelines as you're creating conflict. And occasionally we do see media and advertisers, for example, experiencing a conflict of interest. For example, is it fair to fire a reporter who wrote a critical story about a newspaper's longstanding advertiser? You may say that's right or wrong. You may say that the paper was justified because that reporter is jeopardizing a pretty big revenue stream. You could also say that that firing is not justified because the reporter was just doing her job and talking about something that was going on in the community that people needed to know about. A lot of times we run into issues of people offering to pay reporters to write a positive story about an event or a brand or a phenomenon. Now, of course, I'm not talking about strictly advertising or advertorials. I'm talking about a different set of circumstances here. This is straight up bribery or giving good publicity to an advertiser. Maybe it's not that you are going to be overly critical or you're being paid for it, but a paper might, or magazine or other print media or online media might choose to make an advertiser look really good just because they are an advertiser for that media outlet, and they're not necessarily paid for it, but they are helping an advertiser out. So there are all kinds of tricky ethical issues, and a lot of times one of the problems stems from self-regulation. A lot of media outlets like to say, you know what, we can regulate ourselves. We don't need government intervention. We don't need policy level intervention. We can take care of it ourselves. We trust our professionals. I'll give you some examples of where professional standards have actually fallen short, and we've relied on the media to do more self-regulation. There have actually been some pretty important and prolific action groups that have been responsible for changes in televised and other mediated content. If you've ever seen a parental advisory warning label on a music purchase or a video game purchase, that's not necessarily because of an ethical guideline that was in place for video game makers or musicians. That's because of an action group that banded together and basically forced the industry to pay attention to the need for parents to be able to understand what type of content their children were purchasing and being exposed to. So that's an example of self-regulation and how sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Action for Children's Television is another political action group. They are the group that really did a lot of good in limiting the number of advertisements that can be shown during televised programming directed at children. And they also eliminated drug and vitamin ads from cartoons. I remember being a little kid and watching Saturday morning cartoons and seeing Flintstone vitamins advertised heavily. I loved the chalky taste of a Flintstone vitamin, and also loved the fact that they were advertised on TV and they seemed very important for me to be taking every day. Well, the Action for Children's Television said, you know what, probably not a good idea to advertise for a product that a child really doesn't need to be making a decision about in the first place, particularly one relating to their health. We need to leave that to the parents. So that's why you don't see very many of those ads anymore, if any. That action group did a lot of good in removing a lot of advertisements from kids' TV and limiting the number of drug commercials that kids are exposed to. All right, thank you so much for playing along for this ethics lecture. I look forward to seeing what you think about some of the ethical decision making in the discussion forum this week.